Okay, well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Seán Conlan. I think I know a good few of you, well, some I don't. So you're very, very welcome to our panel conversation. I suppose I was going to say ta fáilte willkommen, welcome, bienvenue, wherever you are. I think we have a few of many linguists out there, so it's great to see you from all these different places. Today is a special event that brings a number of organizations and a number of people together, and I want to mention them initially in by way of introduction and the context. And maybe, Brian, you might bring up that document there a little bit, my introduction and context, and I'll explain why. So it's obviously hosted by, the event is hosted by EHFF, that's the European Health Futures Forum. It's a young organization, and those who don't know it will hopefully get a better understanding as to what we're about as we go through this conversation. But it's an organization that's exploring futures and particularly exploring futures outside the domain of healthcare. So we're looking particularly to education, was what we said, and also to the world of work and the world of business. So it's very appropriate that I'm speaking to you and I'm getting the support of IT Sligo. So that's the Institute of Technology in Sligo, who are through the medium of Brian Mulligan, that you're going to be hearing later on, to a certain extent just hosting this. And they've been to the fore in Ireland in online teaching and learning. The first organisation, educational institution in Ireland to go into online learning. And the last piece of the triangle I want to mention is FASTA. That's F-E-A-S-T-A for those of you who don't know it. It's an Irish word which is well known to most people who go through the Irish educational system through a phrase in a song, in a poem. Cadayenamid FASTA ganaimet. What are we going to do in the future or from now on without wood? And it's a metaphor for what we take into the future for our children and our grandchildren. And FASTA is a kind of a melting pot of ideas. It reflects on society, particularly looking at the domains of economy, of currencies, of the environment, of climate, and so on. And I wanted to put up, it's a fairly special day today because this evening in Dublin, the FASTA members are coming together, and tomorrow we have our AGM. And Mark Garvin, the chairman of FASTA, has written up a context, and it's an actual article on the web, on the FASTA website, if you want to have a look at. And I'm not going to read the whole thing out, but there's some words that come out for me out of this. The context of today and what FASTA looks at is the big picture, and we live in an age of turbulence, of ennui was a word that we used a few years ago to describe where we are. It's a time of ennui or travail if you're English, or it's a contortion of the French word basically. But we certainly live in a very chaotic world, a world of disorder, a world of chaos, of continuing instability in economics and so on. You can be reading the words there, and even though we talk about climate change, and you can see in that last paragraph, we're in an era of ecological crisis that's growing, and while we think it's only the weather that's in question, but in actual fact it's everything: food, water, temperature, even nature. But also the underlying things are the way we treat the economy, the way we treat money, the way we treat work. And ultimately for today, I think we're back to education and health. So I think that's where FASTA fits into this picture. It's a kind of a melting pot of ideas. And it's kind of, I think today our panel, the panel that we've gathered together, reflects these diverging trends. So we have education, we have healthcare, and we have some people in the middle who are reflecting on the models and the way we do things and the organizations and the systems and so on. I think you can see, maybe you can bring that up, Brian, the panel members so that you know them. And in a few seconds, I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves fairly briefly. We're really, really happy, and I suppose it's coincidental. We have 2 from Canada and 2 from the UK, and then Brian and myself are the 2 from Ireland. They're in different parts of the UK and very different parts of Canada as well. And I'm particularly grateful to Dave and Allenna, who've got up very, very early in the morning to participate in this webinar. So thank you very much for coming along. So maybe we suggested, our suggestion for the way we're going to do this is to literally have a conversation. You're very welcome out there to be putting up your own comments, and maybe Brian, you might put up that page of where the individuals can say something or draw something or do something or put a comment on. Feel free to use the chat that's there as well to participate. So the format is going to be that I'm going to put a question to one or other of the panel members, and then it's going to be open to the others to respond as well. So maybe we'll start off with some very short introductions. So maybe we'll start with the one lady among all the men. So Allenna, would you like to just introduce yourself and say a few words about your passion?
Well, hi, my name's Allenna Leonard. I'm here in Toronto, where I moved to join Stafford Beer in 1988, so that's a long time ago, but after Chile. I've been working here doing cybernetics consulting, making arrangements to present ideas at conferences, facilitating the team's integrity process, and doing viable system model workshops and presentations. I just did one of those on Wednesday night to a group at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. So that's kind of where I am, organizational cybernetics and making it work in sustainability and politics are what my main interests are.
Great, thank you, Allenna. Maybe we'll follow that with the other Canadian. Dave, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, I'm a little further east. I'm in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. My name's Dave Cormier. I work at the University of Prince Edward Island, and I guess I work online. My interests are in trying to understand how the new technologies are allowing us to learn in different ways. One of the sort of my core passion, I think, in the way that it intersects work that Seán is talking about today is that when we look at that complexity that Seán is talking about, and we look at the fact that we're now getting thousands or millions of inputs instead of tens or hundreds, how can we learn in that context when knowledge is abundant, when knowledge or seeking information is no longer the goal, when surfing the complexity becomes the goal? And then how do we create educational environments where people are thinking complexly rather than picking sides, which seems to be, I think, maybe one of the, if there is a terrible trend that sort of is coming on the educational side of this, is increasingly we're doubling down on things being true or not true, rather than living inside the complexity and learning how to make good decisions with that uncertainty. So that's where my passion is in trying to understand how we can morph these technologies, and the thing that I talk about inside of that is how we can use the story of the rhizome to explain it.
Great, thank you, Dave. Dave, you might, I'm not sure, I found your volume a little bit weak. I don't know how it was for some of the others. If you maybe bring the microphone a little bit closer to you or shout, if that's okay. Great, thanks very much. So maybe we'll go to Jon in Yorkshire.
Okay, hello everybody, I'm Jon Walker, in a very grey and drizzly Yorkshire today. What I'm going to be talking about today, a thing that's been a passion of mine all my life, is how you let people organise themselves, and how you deal with individual creativity and individual with a human being, and how you work with an organisation. And I spent my life in co-ops, which I'll be talking about in a few minutes. But what I'm really interested in is how you use self-organization and individual autonomy as a basis for an organizational structure, and how you develop that into a whole philosophy of organizing and society and the economy, and work towards a sustainable society, a fair society, all the things that Seán put up in that thing at the beginning, which I'm sure we all agree with. And I realize, I guess in this context, we're just talking about the health at all levels of people, of societies, of communities, and eventually of the whole planet. So that's me.
Great. Thanks very much, John. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say about getting ourselves organised. So David is in the Isle of Wight.
Yes, in the south of England. I just introduced myself. I've worked in the past as a psychiatrist, as a psychoanalyst, as a medical manager, and as someone who got into European policy on health quality initially. About 13 years ago, was it something? It's more than 10 years ago anyway. I hooked up with Seán Conlan because we were members of a group that met regularly to talk about transformational change in organizations with a focus on improving society. So it's much more generic than to do with health. But the reason that I'm here is, and why we're doing this really, is that the sustainability of health systems really is in doubt, but nobody knows how to solve the problem. And after some years working in the policy field, it really seemed to a few of us that actually the pace of change was so slow, it wasn't fit for purpose, and we had to find other ways of looking at how we could change things. And that's why we set up this organization. So Seán is one of the other directors of the EHFF. And it's very interesting to hear the others introducing themselves, because there's so many common issues really that we share coming from slightly different directions.
Great, thanks very much, David. And you just reminded me when I was looking through my notes last night about that lovely word that you used, anomie, that I put up on top of the slide. Mark Garavan used the word travail, which is a contortion of a French word, but that we live in an age of anomie, but we also, and I think Dave Cormier would be interested in this, that we started to use rhizomatic many years ago in that group, but in a very different context. It was in the context of quality and of transformational change, as opposed to just in learning. And I know, Dave, maybe you might talk to us a little bit later about this whole concept of rhizomes and so on. Anyway, thank you all very much. So maybe we'll just kick this off, because some of the themes I think that we may be talking about are already emerging from what you've been saying. And maybe I'd like to turn to John first and just ask him to maybe follow on a little bit on that. Is the actual answer to all of this, societal chaos, and particularly in education and healthcare, is the answer to help people to get themselves organized or to manage themselves, or how can that help?
Okay, well, if you want the quick answer, it's a big part of the solution, but I'll develop that as I go along. So this is going to be a very brief whiz through the stuff that I've done over the last 25, 30 years. And as I said, I've always worked in cooperatives, and anybody else that's ever worked in a co-op must know that when numbers are very small, when you've got up to probably 7 or 8, sometimes 10 people, everything works incredibly well. As numbers grow, you start getting huge problems, and all the techniques which you used, all the ideas around self-organization, people sorting things out, sitting down, sorting problems out, just start to fall apart. And for me, this came to a head when I was working in a large cooperative in Leeds in the 1980s. And this was a large whole food, incredibly successful business, which was at the time with about 35 people. And the day-to-day experience of this was absolutely dreadful, and it was for me quite upsetting, because I'd gone into cooperatives to for lifestyle reasons and to develop these ideas. And what became very clear was that we needed to get smarter and better and wiser at the sort of things we were doing. And in that context, I got in touch with Stafford Beer, who Allenna mentioned earlier. And we started to work with his viable systems model, which is quite an extraordinary body of knowledge. It's originally based on the way the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system coordinate the actions of the muscles and organs. Was very famously used in Chile to deal with the problems Allende was having in the early 70s, and mostly used in big businesses. And I'd sort of seen it in terms of a very interesting idea about big business. But what I was really interested in is how it worked in cooperatives. So I wrote to Stafford Beer, and he was extraordinarily generous, working with me over a few years. And we put this thing in place in Suma. And certain principles started to become very, very clear to me. And one is that you can self-organize, but only up to groups of 7 or 8 people. And beyond that, you need to put structures in place. And the question is how you, certainly in a cooperative, maintain the culture of a cooperative so it doesn't become authoritative and you don't start moving to these ideas of obedience, people doing what they're told, but you continuously work with the idea of autonomous parts coming together. And it became very clear that the work that Stafford was doing, and I think everybody needs to understand that he was working in the steel company in Sheffield in the 1950s, and he was just looking for the best way to organise things. And what emerged from his studies, quite remarkably, was that authority and obedience isn't a very good way to organise things. And you need to get down to this whole thing about people organise themselves in groups, and then how the groups come together synergistically to form the next level, and so on and so forth. And in the work he did in Chile, he took this from the individual up through the work groups and in the factories, right up to the level of the whole state, with 14 different organisational levels. And at each level, the same principles occur. So this is called a recursive or a fractal model. And just amazing principles, but all the time that you're going back to this idea that if you want an effective organisation, you have to base it on the autonomy and the creativity of the individual. So for me, it was great. It was like, cooperatives got it right, and all these authority and obedience structures were ineffective. And I think what also became clear was that as the times and the environment you work in become more turbulent, and the amount of complexity you're dealing with grows and grows and grows, in many cases explosively, so that you're just dealing with an incredibly, sometimes hostile, but always very difficult environment. You definitely need to use these ideas to deal with the amount of complexity you're dealing with. And there's this basic principle of, comes out of organizational cybernetics, which Leonard's probably going to talk about matching the variety of the problems you're dealing with and the way that you're dealing with them. And the whole philosophy comes out of this, which is quite extraordinary. So as this was going on, I started realizing there were certain other organizations that were using the same principles. In those days, I visited the Mondragon co-ops in northern Spain. More recently, I found about the Emilia-Romagna co-ops in northern Italy. And then a few years ago, I sent Allenna Ostrom's work on the commons. And wherever you look, you get the same principles. You get autonomy, you get autonomous groups coming together to form larger wholes. And you need to understand the way that you do this, the politics of cohesion, as sometimes it's called. So I've been sort of developing these ideas and thinking about them. And of course, what you move on to next is that once you've got past just the organizational questions, you're then dealing, okay, well, how does this relate to sustainability? How does this relate to the way that we're treating the planet? How does it relate to inequality? There's a whole range of questions. And this is how I've been working in the last few years. And one of the big opportunities that was I was invited to the Eco Village in Clough Jordan. And Anja and I spent 2 or 3 years working with them in organizational structures based on exactly these principles. And there was a transformation which was very nice to see, that the structures which originally they tried to do it as the way we had in large co-ops, just to say, we'll just sit down and sort this out. with no formal structures or very loose structures. And you do have to put structures in place. And what comes out of this is that you need autonomy, you need these principles of cohesion, and you need these structures. And what's very interesting is that having lived with this, you start to realize that imposing structures on an organization can actually provide more flexibility, more freedom, and a much more rewarding way of working. So we've been working with the Eco Village for some years now. I still work in cooperatives. We're doing various projects with various other levels. And what we're getting to is developing this theory and putting it into place in different ways. And I think, to answer Seán's question, I mean, I think the book that Naomi Klein just wrote, This Changes Everything, is exactly right. And it's almost like everything does have to change. And from my perspective, the organizational structures and the paradigms we use to think about organizations need to change very soon. And I think certainly the work of Stafford Beer is an extraordinarily important part of that. And for me, this is one of the big pieces in the puzzle for building a more sustainable society. Okay, that's it.
Great, Jon. Thanks very much. I don't know, if I could perhaps turn to some of the other panel members, and there's some comments going up there about scale versus scope, and someone's written now. I don't know who's written these, but if any of you want to comment on those, but in the meantime, I want to just maybe turn to Dave. And well, first of all, say, Dave, you're employed by a fairly formal educational establishment, and like I'm sitting in one here, and it's a kind of a very clinical, block-built organization, and yet you're involved in so many different ways with all of these alternative forms and forms of connecting together. First of all, how do you respond to what Jon has been saying about this notion of cooperating and autonomy and matching variety? Does that come into your domain, your world of connecting in education or in the formal education system?
It's interesting. The conflict that you suggest between formal organization and the educational work I do is exactly what I was thinking about when Jon was talking. It's very right now, when we look at the educational system, it's designed on an organizational model and not a good one, the way that was just described, because that would be fantastic. A lot of the work that I do is about learning where there is no organizational model, where we don't have an organization to speak of. So when we ran the first MOOC in 2008, MOOC is massive open online course. They've become terribly trendy and then stopped being trendy. But back when we were doing this as research in 2008, the idea was to say, what happened if we invite everybody? We take the monetary restrictions off, and we take the access restrictions on, and we bring everybody into a conversation, and we open up the possibility for dialogue. So a couple of thousand people showed up, and then all of a sudden the scale that Jon was talking about starts to become an issue, right? If you have what you can do with 20 people is not what you can do with 100, it's not what you can do with 2,000 or 3,000, and it becomes different. But in the work we've been doing since, and the work that I've done this year and hopefully next year, I'm not even having a syllabus. So the idea is to make the community itself the curriculum. So participation in a community of knowing as the curriculum for knowing. So one of the things about organizations is they tend to have built-in goals assigned to them. It may be as simple as a value statement. It may be as simple as a financial goal. But those organizational outcomes tend to structure the way that we talk about success. Whenever we talk about learning openly online, those outcomes and those ties aren't there, because you have different people from different cultures coming in with different backgrounds with totally different outcomes that they're looking for. And that is where, to me, the technology allows us to bypass the financial restrictions we would have had 20 years ago. If you wanted to bring in 5,000 random people to a conversation 20 years ago, I'm not even sure how you would have done it, because at some point, the decision-making process you would have done to invite people to that process speaks for your organizationalness. Whereas now, we can send out an invitation onto the internet and have people who we've never met, we have no idea how they've come to us, will come and participate in the discussion and totally change what it means to know in that context simply by their presence. and by the knowledge they bring from whatever perspective they're coming from. So for me, the ways in which groups form inside of that is fascinatingly like what Jon described inside of an organization, because they do tend to get down to those groups of 7 or 8, except that each of those groups of 7 or 8 have a group of 25 or 30 that surround them in a peripheral participation manner. So you end up with cores of 7 or 8, and then groups around them, and then those pockets overlap in a variety of ways as they tend to organize. And I think when we look at how we can make learning more viable going forward, how we can make it more sustainable, and how we can make it more flexible, I think that accepting that as a valid mechanism for learning when we don't have specific outcomes, when the outcomes come out of the discourse, I think is one of the ways to make that happen.
Great. Okay. I just want to maybe turn to Allenna. When you hear all that, Allenna, and when you hear about, casual groups and then groups outside them being a little bit more organized, when the ideas that Jon's been putting forward and Dave, how do you see those from a cybernetics point of view, or would you have any insights or comments, or what's going on, what happened with MOOCs with thousands of people being involved that would have been impossible even a few years ago?
Well, I think what Jon was talking about really is very cybernetic. The online learning community obviously needs to be self-organizing. But what I was looking at essentially is, how do you handle the variety of people and their needs? Because although we all have essentially common characteristics, they're expressed in very different ways at very different times in our lives. So I'm reminded of a model that Stafford built. It was a very simple in concept. It was a basic homeostat with a high variety block, a low variety block, and a goal where there would be efforts on the part of the low variety block to keep the high variety block moving towards a better solution. So the goal was to keep people healthy. The high variety block was the people who were not healthy for one reason or another. The low variety block was those people who were healthy, because it's a little like this Tolstoy comment that happy families are mostly alike. Well, healthy people have a lot in common too. The great variation comes when you have unhealthy people. So the balance point or homeostat that he looked at is, how can you communicate and offer treatments that would take the people out of the high variety group of unhealthy people and bring them back into the group of healthy people. And some of that was traditional medicine, but much of it was community support, family support, various kinds of alternative ways of dealing with wellness, things like yoga, exercise. And it was a very big picture kind of operation. And it looked at, how do you change the system so that that becomes more possible? If you look at the work now being done in Sweden, where they have a goal of 0 traffic deaths, that's a bit of a simpler example. They looked at the traffic death situation in Sweden and thought, people are going to continually make mistakes. You can't keep trying to enforce what people do. You need to redesign the system so that the easiest thing for people to do is the safest thing. So they had a number of different steps that they took. For instance, in order to prevent head-on collisions in rural areas, they put a barrier up the center line so that people couldn't run into the center line and cross into the other lane. They lowered speed limits in cities. They put in speed bumps. There were a number of particular things that they did to essentially increase the variety of the community to be able to control traffic and prevent traffic deaths. So that's a more simple example. I'd like to mention a little bit about the syntegration process, since Jon really did a pretty complete job on the VSM in the context of this group. The syntegration process brings together roughly 30 people around a common interest or a common goal. And the idea is, if you can combine multiple perspectives of people working in 5-member teams with a critic or an outside opinion coming in, then the chances are you're going to get a lot fewer surprises. And there's so many instances today, particularly in the public sector, where people get together in policy planning boardrooms or wherever, and they have not considered the users. They have not considered how it will actually roll out. They haven't considered what's needed in place to support what they want to do. And so quite often you have massive breakdowns. You have usually insufficient resources to implement whatever the plans are. So you have huge time lags. You have a very difficult time correcting the errors that inevitably occur. And there's so much more that could be done in terms of trying to build the system, trying to use the design principles on the front end rather than coming up with a political solution quite often that covers only part of the problem and doesn't deal with the full variety. And I'd just like to close by mentioning the work in Chile again. That was an effort to bring together a great many aspects of government and the productive economy so that they serve people. And that went from using industrial designers to using mathematicians to using a great number of people, artists, sociologists. And the idea was that you could use all this new technology in a way that would support ordinary citizens in doing their ordinary routine things that they wanted to do. And you had real-time management, but management that allowed for, before anything got kicked up to the next level for interference or intervention, the people at the level where the problem occurred had a certain amount of time to correct the problem. And quite often they would be able to do this. They were able to select their own indices, which usually would be added to the 10 or so that would be part of the viable system model to report. And they wouldn't have to communicate even what those indices were. And you see the contrast now between algorithms used to determine, say, what someone's sentence is if they get into the criminal justice system. And what that does is it basically means that if a middle-class person commits a crime, they do the algorithm and that person gets a very light sentence. Someone from a marginal population commits the same act, and they say, well, they're a risk to reoffend, so they get a much heavier sentence. And it's a very unfair way of using algorithms, mathematics, all the technology at our disposal in order essentially, whether it's intended or not, to reinforce privilege and to push the marginal even further out to the margins. So I think it would be really great if we could come together and recapture that spirit that was present in Chile, to use technology and all of the resources we have at our disposal to make it work for the average person and to make it work for the people who are vulnerable as opposed to the people who have the advantages and know how to game the system. So I think I'd like to stop there and let it move on.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Allenna. Very, very insightful. I'd just encourage the panel in particular to be reading some of the comments that are going up, and I'd encourage you out there on the participants to be putting up your thoughts as well. But maybe we'll just go on to draw David Somekh in. And David, I don't know, first of all, you may have some reaction to what you've been hearing there, and particularly what Allenna was saying about those committing crimes, because I know a significant part of your background was in that area. You might explain what I mean by that. And then maybe you might just talk to us a little bit about, I mean, you bridge to a certain extent into healthcare from outside, and you also have insights as to where we as a group in EHF see parallels between education and healthcare. But is it possible to carry out a whole transformation of the system from within, or do you have to be outside to enable that to happen? I'll hand over to you. And
thanks. Yes, it's extraordinary listening to the colleagues talking about their approaches. This issue of convergence. You know, because, for example, what Jon was talking about, I was immediately struck by the parallels with the guys who are seen as the kind of social psychologists who played a huge role in the approach to scenario planning that we use now. These are people from the Tavistock Institute, you know, going back into the 60s, Tristan Emery. And the parallel between, they had this causal textures theory of organizations, which I think, again, converges on what Stafford Beer was doing. It's extremely interesting, but that sounds terribly academic and technical, but it's just about commonalities, really. The thing that I think comes out of the conversation so far for me is how extraordinary it is that on one level, technology is seen as something which is a powerful lever for change and a facilitator. And at the same time, in a funny way, it's a red herring, you know, because we're human beings after all. And one of the huge issues is the way that humans behave, both in terms of, and again, this is kind of touched on by Allenna, because I saw the parallels with what she was saying about that model of health and sickness. And the thing about variety is that actually my particular interest in policy at the moment is patient empowerment. And what this entails is really looking at the way that both individuals who need help with their health and the health professionals need to change in the way that they relate to each other in order to bring about substantial change. I mean, just touching on what Seán was hinting at, of course, one of the ways, if you think about human behavior and the behavior of large groups, you get tribal phenomena and vested interest, which maintains the status quo in a very powerful way. And health, just as business or education, is an example of how those tribal groups try and prevent change because they see it as threatening their power base or their interests. Now, the notion, one of the things that stimulated us to start EHFF was the principle of disruptive innovation. In other words, if you can't change things from within because of those powerful forces, then the notion that has been floated really relatively recent by, I think, Harvard academics, that applied first to business and then to health, was this notion that the way you disrupt these big rigid organizations is by demonstrating outside of them there is a different way of doing things. Now, it's not quite the same thing talking about disruptive innovation in relation to patient empowerment, but the fact is, if you can be successful in changing the way that citizens operate, when they go to ask for healthcare. In other words, that they're more informed, that they have a more equal relationship, which has to be facilitated by the professionals, then that changes the whole dynamics of the system. It forces change, because if people are behaving differently, if health professionals are acting as coaches instead, then the whole system has to change, and this disrupts what otherwise seems like an impenetrable barrier, really. Now, I could go on and on, but I'd just say one other thing about the point about large organizations and individuals and technology. I was at a meeting 2 days ago in London on ethics in business, and there's some very high power bankers and fund managers and so on there, as well as some people interested in reintroducing the Quaker ideals to business and the whole thing about values, and the loss of values that's happened. And someone said something I thought very profound about the fact that the huge danger to the business system, which is supposedly based on the notion that wealth is good for society because it creates opportunity for people, because provided you maintain the value, the notion that you give something back to society, that kind of moral principle is undermined if you move from a relationship-based business model to a transactional one. And this is where they were arguing that technology has blighted the business environment, because of course now with derivatives and so on, everything is done by computer, and people own shares for microseconds, whereas previously they held on to them for 15 years because they were investing in something. But I think if you take that principle on the wider level about the danger of losing touch with relationships as a central part of the way society works, I think it's very interesting.
Thanks very much, David. If I could just maybe turn back to Dave and ask him to pick up something. David mentioned, gets confused between David and Dave, but David mentioned the whole question of patient empowerment, and to a certain extent, I think that's at the heart of where some of the new learning approaches are going, is learner empowerment as opposed to teacher empowerment. But then there's also this behind, he mentioned as well, and Allenna mentioned the values as almost like a whole platform that we need to take more into consideration. So looking with your two hats on inside a fairly formal educational establishment, and then looking at what's going on in the world, how would you respond to what's going on there in education about empowerment and learner empowerment, given all the constraints about accreditation and exams and all the rest of that?
Well, I mean, not to go too wild on this, but it was not all that long ago that a university held its power based on the fact that it contained both the knowledge and also the people who had access to knowledge that you couldn't access in any other way. 500 or 600 years ago, that was stark. Even 30 or 40 years ago, it was still pretty strong. Whereas now that particular locus of power essentially doesn't exist. And I think that when we look at the change in empowerment, we are no longer as institutions approaching the world from the safety of having special access to this stuff. And I think it's interesting with medicine, it's much the same way. I look at my 7-year-old father who goes into the doctor's office fully armed with a suite of research that he has done on his way in the door, and is, I won't say picking his own medication, but he's at the point now where he will have long extended discussions with his doctor about the validity of certain approaches, because he believes that there's a stark amount of ageism that's built into the process, that as he is 7 years old, he is not going to leave the doctor's office and go grab his chainsaw and go cut out a trail, which is exactly what he was going to do. So he has to break through those structures, and he is now empowered in a way to be able to do that, that he himself was not when he was 55. And I think that access to information and knowledge is there. The problem is, as any doctor will tell you, is that there's a large number of people who are walking in with large numbers of things they do not understand. And to me, the solution to that is not to send them through a formal educational system, but rather to connect them with other people who also have access to knowledge and allow them to learn together. Like any other field that is changing and morphing, medicine is what is true 5 years ago in many cases is not true now. And in order to keep abreast of what's going on, the tradition was always to find journal articles and find these sort of pieces. Now you can actually connect directly with people who are working on the cutting edge or working on new and different ways. And I think a great example is what they're doing in Brazil right now with the eradication of the food pyramid. So Brazil has now banned the food pyramid, and essentially what they've done is developed a series of literacies that you should think of. So instead of you need to eat this many grains, and instead of a very content-based approach, because now the content is available, we don't need to talk about content in quite the same way. Here are the literacies. You should eat with others. You need to think about food in positive ways. You should eat real food rather than processed food. And they're guiding principles rather than an attempt at trying to store all the content into one tiny pyramid. And I think if you look at that as a microcosm for the way that we can empower everybody to be part of a conversation, the content's available. What we need are connective tissues, and whether those tissues are communities, which is the work that I do, or whether they're organizations, we can have different kinds of participation that allow people to become empowered outside of the sort of, maybe too strong a word, but authoritarian testing and structures. Whereas, because in my particular perspective, and I was typing this in the background here, learning is different than a lot of other things, and that learning is not really a counting down. It's not really measurable. So the problem when we bring technology in is that too often, because the technology leans towards math, we tend to try to mathify the learning process and make it a counting thing, when in reality it's more of a human thing. It's far more complex than that.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. Just maybe, John, just a final one to you, and then we'll try and address some of these questions or comments that are coming up. Connecting has come up many times in the conversation since you did your little intervention earlier on. And I know in learning there's a whole connectivism movement, and there's also even the rhizomatic thing where you're talking about a link, but then at the same time becoming independent. So, and to me, that maybe is reflected in all of the work that Stafford Beard did. Maybe my comment on the importance of connecting as opposed to being autonomous. So how does, when you hear what's going on in healthcare about empowerment and independence and so on, from a model point of view, how do you see connecting?
Okay, well, there's a lot of issues here, but I think certainly from the point of view of the model and viable systems and Stafford Beard's work, we're talking about trying to get as much autonomy at the local level as you can, and certainly in health, that should be the community level, where people are thinking about how they deal with their own health, and then how they deal with their families, and at the community level, and all the things that are involved in that, and not this thing that, you feel bad, so you go to the doctor and you expect to be taken care of. There's a whole sort of dynamic here that works in both directions, that if you want to be autonomous, you have to take a lot more responsibility for your own life, and not expect people to take care of you. And interestingly, the work that the Peer-to-Peer Foundation are doing, they're now talking about the state as the partner state, and I really like that, because it sort of it puts the emphasis on this whole thing about autonomy and people working together and partnering with the state rather than just relinquishing all your responsibility to get things done. So I think that's really crucial. The other thing I'd like to mention is that I read that in Quebec there's been a boom in health and social care cooperatives, which has been based on the state giving resources to individuals where they can actually buy their own social care, and how that's kind of changed the whole dynamic. So people are now much more in control, much more autonomous, and it's resulted in a whole spate of new cooperatives setting up, which have been very successful, lowered the costs of providing health and social care quite dramatically. and provides quite an interesting model about how these things could work. And certainly in terms of the cooperatives in northern Italy, the Emilia Romagna co-ops, they work in exactly that way, that they maintain lots and lots and lots of very, very small, very innovative cooperatives, enormous amounts of innovation and thinking and new ideas. And these guys actually compete within a framework for bids which their secondary cooperatives go for, quite often at a global level. They get huge contracts that each of the small cooperatives would be completely incapable of getting. But then they work together and their autonomy thrives. And if somebody comes up with a really great idea, then they might displace one of the other co-ops. But you get this beautiful, this little ecosystem, which I really like. And the connectivity issue is well, I think, Seán, it's probably the fundamental issue that all the work that we've been talking about in organizational cybernetics and viable systems, it's about moving away from the old scientific approach, which is saying, okay, we'll cut things up into little bits, the old reductionist paradigm, and saying we can understand it in those terms. And all the systems ideas say you can't do that, and it's the connections that really matter. And in fact, when Stafford was asked for one sentence on the viable systems model, he said something like, there are 5 systems, but what's really important are the intricate interconnections between them. And it's all this intricate interconnections and how those work and how those result in the kinds of systems that we've been talking about today.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jon. So now I'm going to open it up to anybody on the panel who wants to pick up any one of those little comments that's there. If you want to go for one or ask a question about it. My good old friend Demi in quality used to often say that the question is more important than the answer. So I'm not really looking for answers, but maybe, you know, a comment from anybody. Anybody like to pick up one? David, go for it.
Okay, just a couple of things. It's very interesting. I was in, bizarre coincidence, I was in Brazil 3 or 4 days ago at a conference of health educationalists. And it's partly because the Brazilian government is trying to completely reorganize the educational system for health professionals for all kinds of reasons. They're very go ahead. But of course there, the interesting thing was about bringing groups together again for me, which was, there were a few of us there who were interested in health planning, and most of them were coming from the academic direction and telling us about how they were changing the teaching of professions. And it's again, it's about understanding the point of view of the other side, really, to get the maximum out of it. But I was very interested in what Jon was saying as well. It's an issue which about complexity, the complexity that Dave was talking about, which is that actually one of the difficulties when there's so much information around is picking up details, because you can't know what's going on. So Jon was talking about something actually in the UK, or in England anyway, personal care budgets are actually a project that's going on now. It's not making as much impact perhaps as it is in Quebec, but they are actually something that people are experimenting with. I think, and indeed the model of healthcare now, I think for the people who are looking at the edge of how things should be changing, is very much about community-based and about, people talk about co-production of health, meaning the integration of all the players, really. So I just want to throw that in.
Great, thanks, Dave. Anybody else want to pick up something? Allenna, do you see something?
I'd like to mention the comments made by someone I interviewed in the course of a project here in Canada, who said that the medical care available, which is single payer and you don't have to pay individually in Canada, that was the 4th factor in terms of how healthy someone would be. The first was the income equality factor. So if they're poor, they wouldn't be healthy. The second was their lifestyle. The third was their profession. And the medical care available came in 4th. And so the looking at income equality and lifestyle as ways of helping people to be more healthy and constructing communities. For example, one of the real problems is people many times can't afford to live near where they work. So they spend a lot of time commuting, either on public transport or in a car, but that means they have no time to get any exercise. They are pressed for time and are less likely to cook real food, and they have extra stress because sometimes commuting is more stressful than whatever they face at work. So I think that those larger factors in the community and how those connect are important. And I also wanted to say a little bit about the situation with learning, is that in some countries, I think most crucially in the United States, students are graduating with so much debt that becomes a serious burden on their ability to engage in any kind of activity. And even while they are in school, most of them are now working part-time, so that they actually are going to class and working and, eating and sleeping, as opposed to actually having what we would call a university experience.
Okay. Great. Well, except any of you have got a burning comment. It's approaching 1 o'clock here, and I did ask Brian Mulligan to wrap things up. Brian is hovering around the background, hopefully. But before I ask Brian to do that, is anybody got any final concluding remark, words of wisdom for us that you'd like to say that wasn't said? Anything? You can raise your hand. I'm looking at the panel. No, you're all okay. All great. Good. Okay. Well, then I'm going to hand over to Brian. Brian, would you like to put it all together? There's a challenge for you, Brian.
No, not really. And I don't think I will be able to. I mean, my head sort of hurts with all the interesting ideas that are coming at me, and they're so diverse. I suppose I could just make a few comments that have occurred to me, maybe because you did actually say what next, and I really don't know what next, except all of these topics themselves have great potential to be drilled down to in themselves. So we could ask for maybe individual discussions on these in the future. I suppose some of the things that I would have observed was, to a large extent, this is about enabling change in a time where we really need changes in our systems, because if we keep going on the way we are, things could get much worse for us. I sort of feel that there's a theme coming through here that rather than the idea of deterministic design, experts do seem to be incapable of designing solutions that work well. We always find out something. So to some extent, designing the conditions from which solutions emerge seems to be a better way. That what we need to do is we need to be understanding the psychology of individuals and groups so that we can nudge them, which I think is a term that's been used relatively recently, into doing these things for themselves. I also felt that the issue of, design versus Darwinianism is a concept that comes in here as well, and the sense that it is very hard to find optimum ways of doing something, and one of the best ways of doing this is to allow lots of people to try different ideas and let the best ones emerge from that. And that's quite Darwinian, and a lot of people have certain concerns about Darwinianism, particularly because to do that, lots of people must fail, lots of systems must fail. And we do, if we want to move in that direction towards allow lots of people try different things and the best ones emerge, we do need to be very tolerant of failure, if not even encouraging failure. Those are just a few comments that I would have that would occur to me during that. I don't know if that's useful to people, but to some extent maybe I'm acting as just the typical bystander here, the layman, and saying the ideas that come into my head. And I'd like to thank the speakers for just real great stimulation here today, and it's going to leave me thinking a lot about this in the future. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, and thanks very much, Brian, for that. And I just want to draw it all together, firstly by thanking the panel, as Brian has done. I know they didn't really know what they were letting themselves in for, but I think they've done a very, very good job. Thank you very, very much, and particularly, as I mentioned, to Allenna and Dave for getting up so early in the morning over there. That's great. I do want to mention again EHFF and FASTA, and if any of you want to get more involved in either of those organizations, you're more than welcome. They're two good websites, and you'll find all the contact details there. There will be a recording of this, which the link will put up on both of the websites, on EHFF and FASTA, and we'll probably tweet and do all the rest for it. If you've got any suggestions yourselves about it, you can either email me, or you all have my email address, or you can put up something again on either of those websites. That's what I would say. We'd be very, very, very open to any comments, feedback, what you liked, what you didn't like, how we can improve. If you want more of it, or less of it, or more of whatever. But anyway, once again, thanks to all, and thanks to our participants for coming along. There are still 11 people at least logged in, so that's great. Thanks very much, and some of you I'll be seeing later on today, I think. So looking forward to seeing you. So all the best. Slán ó bhaile, gur míle maith agat. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.